welcome back to Season 5 of the Changing Earth podcast with Sarah F. Hathaway, blending survival fiction and fact to bring you entertaining education that will help you dream, survive, and thrive. And now, here's your host, Sarah F. Hathaway.
Hey guys, what is up? Welcome back to the Changing Earth podcast. This is episode number 191, Season 5, episode 28, and I've got a great show for you today. Really cool story and a super cool guest, so stay tuned for that. Update on the preparedness experience that is happening in Las Vegas on March 22nd, the weekend of March 22nd. I know the dates are in there. Just go to www.thepreparednessexperience.com to get all the information on that. Really hope to see you out there. I'll be teaching a class on self-defense out there, so I'm super excited about being able to share my gifts with everybody else and get people self-defense ready. So super stoked on that. Hope to see you out there at the Preparedness Experience at the end of March 22nd. Thank you to all of my subscribers who are doing your part to keep the changing Earth world turning. I really, really appreciate all you do. I've been adding some great video outtakes and audio outtakes over there. So if you haven't been over to your membership page in a while, go on over there and check that out. And everybody who hasn't subscribed yet, please take a moment to go over there and do that. It's www.authorSarahFhathaway.com/support. That's www.author, S-A-R-A, F like Frank, Hathaway, HATHAWAY.com/support, and you can go ahead and get signed up and get access to all those goodies. So I really encourage you to go ahead and do that. I'm also going to put a coupon code up over on that page for all of you for the Changing Earth merchandise, so you can show the love out there. So really appreciate all you guys do. Really, I can't tell you enough how much I do appreciate all the support that you give me to keep our show going. I promised you that I would be doing a write-up on my jiu-jitsu experience and my jiu-jitsu testing, and I have that all ready to go, and you can find a link to that on today's episode at the Changing Earth Survival Guide. So head on over to my website, click on the Survival Guide, today's episode, and you can get that link to the jiu-jitsu blog. I'll also have it out on Facebook, so if you're following me around on Facebook, I'll go ahead and put that up over there as well, because it's going to go out on my martial arts studios website, and then I'll go ahead and share the link from there. So that'll be a lot of fun. Spring is on the way, right? So tons of stuff to do now that spring's here. We got trees to clean up that came down. We got branches to clean up. We got to start spraying and just getting ready for summer, which is spectacular in my book. I'm kind of over winter at this point and ready to get outside and get a lot of stuff done. So really looking forward to that. Hopefully, I know that you guys, a lot of the country was hit with a severe storm this past week, and I hope everybody's safe. Hope everybody's doing well, and you're looking forward to spring as much as I am, because we've really had a trial for a winter this year. So today, or let's start out with last week. Last week in the Dark Days in Denver adventure, we caught back up with Bennett, who was catching up with Vince. And Vince survived his ordeal, and he's alive, and he's trying to heal up so that they can, figure out what happened, where is everybody, and are they okay? In the meantime, this week, we're going to go back to Erica's story, and, she's with her captives, and that's why this is kind of a dark book, and we have the Yellowstone volcanic catastrophe overhanging everything, and that's going to be with us for a while. So today, I am so excited to have Michael Poland on the show. He is the lead scientist in charge of the Yellowstone Observatory, and he is here today to discuss the realities of these volcanic risks that exist all across the world. And we're also going to touch on Yellowstone a little bit and talk about what's been happening there recently and what the future looks like for Yellowstone. So really, really cool interview that I did. I was super stoked to have Michael on the show, and just excited that I got to pick his brain a little bit and spend a little time with him. So let's go ahead and get into chapter 28 of the Dark Days in Denver adventure, and then we'll jump right into that interview with Michael. Chapter 28. Erica could see the med center in the distance as the SUV drove south, out of town. She knew Star was in there, recouping. Erica tried to mentally connect with her. She couldn't get the image of Vince out of her mind. He was dead. She was alone. "Eyes forward," Swenson barked, smacking her across the face. Erica looked to the front of the car. The man driving was a quiet, reserved guy. Erica didn't hear him talk much. The passenger was the man giving directions. "I don't know why I had to sit all the way back here. I got us the vehicle," Merkley whined from the extra row of seats in the back. "Shut up, Merkley," the man sitting to Erica's right said in a Russian accent. "You shut up, Serge. I gave her to you guys, didn't I? The Supreme General will put me in charge of the Western region now. Right, Carl?" he whined to the commanding man. "You'll get what's coming to you, and don't call me Carl," he replied. "They call you Carl," Merkley protested. "They're my friends. You can call me Commander Gray," he responded. "Now shut the hell up," Swenson snapped. "Yeah, we can do that," Commander Gray spoke into a radio. "Pull over up here, Bishop." The driver pulled the vehicle over by an overpass that looked back over the mountains. "Get her out of the vehicle, Swenson," the commander ordered. Swenson wrenched her head forward and snapped the mask on her face. "Come on, girlie," he barked at her as he ripped her out of the vehicle. Erica dropped down quickly and kicked his legs out from under him. He fell hard on the ground. Swinging her legs around, she was back on her feet, but Serge was there. Grabbing the back of her head, he slammed her into the vehicle. Swenson stood up, infuriated. "Now that wasn't very nice, was it? We're going to have to teach you a lesson," he seethed, touching his mask with hers. His eyes were filled with hatred. Erica stood firmly in front of him. "Swenson, knock it off. The Supreme General wants her to see this," Commander Gray told him. "Put her over here." Swenson gripped her so hard, Erica thought her bones would break, and she could feel the bruising forming instantly. He walked her across the edge of the overpass and shoved her to her knees. They were looking back at Denver. It was hard to see in the expanse, but in the distance she could see smoke from the recent battle rising into the air. Then, from the right side of the horizon, she saw planes entering her view. Erica expected them to bomb Denver, but instead, she watched them fly into the foothills. The mountains lit up with bombing activity in a north-to-south pattern. Occasionally, one of the planes would turn into a ball of fire itself, dotting the mountainside. "Do you know what that was?" the commander asked her. Erica didn't say a thing. She dared not utter the words that she thought were true. "That was everyone you love blowing up in a ball of fire," he said without emotion. Erica tried to get up, but Serge and Swenson were on each side of her, holding her down. Her knees ground into the pavement. "Your husband is dead. Your son that Mommy left behind at the homesteads is gone. It's only a matter of time until they find your daughter. We know right where she is. You see, Erica, your life is over. You are now the property of the Federal Republic of America," Commander Gray told her. "Bishop, do you have the tracker?" "Yes, sir," he replied, digging in his backpack. He produced an implant device and approached Erica. She tried to struggle and get out of the men's grip, but they only squeezed her shoulders harder and ground her further into the pavement. The commander held her right arm out with the palm up while Bishop put the device above her wrist. He clicked the button and Erica's arm burned with pain. She stared at him fiercely, but didn't utter a word. "She's got a high pain tolerance," Bishop whispered to Commander Gray as he dropped her arm and stood up. Commander Gray grabbed her arm and showed it to her. "See? Property of the Federal Republic of America," he told her, making her look at it. There was a new tattoo of a barcode with a number above it, and property of FROA written underneath it. She knew the pain was not only superficial, they'd implanted her with something as well. "Now your family is gone, and you belong to the Supreme General, Nicholas Henderson. That is your life now, and the sooner you accept that, the easier your life will be." Erica couldn't say a word. She didn't want to believe him, but she had seen Vince fall with her own eyes. "I can't believe he's gone," she thought sadly as tears fell down her cheeks. "Look at it!" Commander Gray grabbed her chin and forced her to watch the fires burning in the mountains. "They're dead." Erica's heart longed to be back there in the distance. She'd lost the love of her life, and the life of everyone else that she loved was in peril. She needed to think of some form of escape plan, but these men were relentless, trained,
and skilled at their work. As they stood her up, gripping her shoulders tightly, Erica quickly threw a side kick, aimed for Surge's midsection, and immediately followed it up with a hook kick to Swenson's head. The kicks landed, and they let her go, but the hardened men were barely fazed. She dropped down into a squatted position to evade them grabbing after her, but Bishop was there and grabbed her by the ponytail as she scrambled to get away. "Get me more zip ties," Swenson told Surge, grabbing a hold of Erica's neck as Bishop held her by her bound hands and ponytail. "Nobody runs from me," Swenson whispered into her ear, touching his mask to hers. She stared into his dark eyes as Surge returned with 4 more zip ties. "Put her back on her knees," Swenson directed Bishop. He pulled on her hair and hands. Erica steadied herself, trying to resist. Swenson rolled his eyes at Surge and went around to the backside of Erica. He kicked her knee from the back and she fell hard on the ground. He came and held her shoulder, squeezing it with his hand and pressing down onto it. As Surge went around to put the zip ties on her ankle, she gave him a firm back kick to the head and dropped down out of Bishop and Swenson's grasp. She rolled forward and started to run. She could hear Swenson laughing sadistically behind her. He took out his whip and lashed it around her neck. Pulling down swiftly, he dragged her to the ground. Surge and Bishop grabbed her arms again. "Put her on her stomach," Swenson directed, infuriated with her actions. The wind was exhaled from her lungs as he knelt his knee into the small of her back. Each ankle received a zip tie, then he used 2 zip ties looped together to form makeshift shackles. "This is bullshit, sir. You gotta let me have 1 strike at her so she understands the penalties of her actions," Swenson told the commander, kneeling harder into her back. Commander Gray didn't reply to his request. He was headed for the car and opened the door, looking back at Swenson. Erica's mask pressed tightly to her face as they held her down. It was hard to breathe with Swenson pressing on her and the stifling mask. She struggled as she listened to them banter, which only made Swenson grind his knee into her more. "She killed Gerber," Swenson told the commander. "You're just pissed because she knocked you on your tail. Get over it, TJ," Commander Gray replied. "So maybe I am. That's one more reason I should get a whack at her," he countered. General Henderson said pure and unbroken, he insisted. "Dang, Carl, I'm not raping the girl. I just want to hit her 1 freaking time with Sheila," TJ huffed. "Fine, but just once," Commander Gray acquiesced. "Bishop, Surge, put her back on her knees. I do love watching Sheila work," he said, sitting down in the car. The 2 men lifted her torso up so her knees would bend and then held her firmly in place. Erica could hear TJ pacing around like a crazed tiger behind her. "That's right, Sheila. We only get 1 snap, so it better be good," he said, talking to his whip. Erica braced herself for his strike. She kept tensing her muscles, waiting for the moment of pain, but it didn't come. "Nope, not yet, Sheila," TJ said, dancing around a little now. "Just freaking do it," Surge urged him. Erica stayed tensed and ready, but her muscles were starting to give out. Today she had entered hell, and her brain burned with pain. She relaxed for a moment, trying to regather her strength, when crack! The whip tore through her back. Then crack! TJ snapped it again quickly and tore through her again, forming a T. "I said once," Commander Gray barked at him. "Don't mess around, TJ. The general will put your head next to hers." "Sorry, I always mark my territory," Swenson said, admiring the T bleeding on Erica's lower back. "Get her back in the car," Commander Gray said, shutting his door. As she was shoved into the car by Swenson, Erica's mind and body became numb with pain. She could barely feel the steady trickle of blood as it slipped down her back and pooled underneath her.
Her escape attempt failing, Erica learns that TJ Swenson is not a man to be trifled with. And he's just this character that makes sure that he gets his job done no matter what it is. And he takes a lot of pride and enjoyment in doing what he does. So he's a character that's going to be with us for a little while. We'll have to see what happens with his storyline as it progresses. But in the meantime, Erica is just, caught in the state of misery, sheer misery. And her world is just glooming over like the sky above her. And, they force her to watch this bombing happen. These planes are trying to fly through the volcanic fallout from Yellowstone. And even though they've been fitted and they've tried to make sure the planes can survive in this ash cloud, a lot of them are crashing and things like that. So I wanted to take a look at the realities of not only Yellowstone, but what other volcanic threats there are around us. This is a big topic for the changing Earth because earthquakes and volcanoes go hand in hand together, as Michael's going to talk about when he comes on the show. And so I'm just super excited that I got to have an interview with Michael Poland. He is the scientist in charge of the Yellowstone Volcanic Observatory. Mike is a research geophysicist with the Cascades Volcano Observatory and the current scientist in charge of the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory. His area of specialization is volcano geodesy, which emphasizes the surface deformation and gravity fields associated with volcanic activity. This work involves the use of space-based technologies like interferometric synthetic aperture radar, as well as ground-based techniques like microgravity surveys. Mike has taken part in studies on a variety of volcano systems in the United States, including Mount St. Helens and other volcanoes of the Pacific Northwest, Kilauea and Mauna Loa volcanoes in Hawaii, and the Yellowstone caldera. His recent work has focused on using gravity change over time to understand the character of the fluids that drive volcanic unrest, and also on the potential of satellite data to improve forecasts of future changes in volcanic activity. So this man knows his stuff when it comes to volcanoes. He's been researching them for a lifetime. Was super excited to have him on the show. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and welcome Michael to the Changing Earth podcast. Today, I am here with Michael Poland, a brand new guest on our show, and I am so happy to have you on. So, Michael, I'm just going to hand over the mic to you, and why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience, let them know a little bit about who you are and what you're currently working on.
Sure. Well, thanks a lot for having me on. So I'm a geophysicist with the U.S. Geological Survey, and I'm currently based at the Cascades Volcano Observatory in Vancouver, Washington, just across the Columbia River from Portland, Oregon. I do geophysical studies on a number of volcanoes, but my focus right now is actually on Yellowstone, and I serve as the scientist in charge of the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory, which is a consortium of agencies and institutions that's tasked with monitoring and better understanding Yellowstone. So lately I've been spending a lot of my time visiting Yellowstone and thinking about what's happening beneath the ground at Yellowstone, and especially coordinating the monitoring and research activities of all of the institutions that are engaged in the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory, trying to make sure that we're focused on the most important problems and the most important issues that are barriers basically to better understanding how Yellowstone works.
I got to tell you, I'm a little bit jealous. I think if I had my life to do over again, I would have probably minored or something in geophysics, or how do you say that? Geophysicism?
Yeah, geophysics.
Yeah, because just a very, very interesting topic to me. And then we've been doing a lot of Yellowstone watching ourselves. So just a great topic to be involved in. And how many organizations are actually involved out there is just mind-boggling. So coordinating them certainly has to be a challenge.
Yeah, you definitely have to have a lot of communication skills to work with all the agencies, not just the agencies, but then I think there's a very important component of public outreach that goes along with the Yellowstone job, just because there's so much interest in Yellowstone. It's the subject of so many documentaries, and not just about the volcano, but about the natural system there as well, the wildlife and the landscapes. So
right.
It's definitely something that people aren't getting bored with.
Yep, it just keeps coming back up.
Yeah.
Hopefully not literally.
Oh yeah, right, exactly.
So, Michael, where are the most active volcanoes on our planet located? Where should the red flags really kind of be at this time right now?
Well, they tend to be located along these systems called subduction zones, which is where one plate dives beneath another, and one of these where these tectonic plates are coming together. And so the most famous such zone kind of extends all the way around the Pacific Rim, the Ring of Fire is the popularized name for it. And it's sort of a ring of subduction zones that stretches starting down in New Zealand, and it goes up through Indonesia, the Philippines, Japan, Kamchatka, around Alaska, then down the west coast of the U.S., through Central America, and then down to the tip of South America. There's a few other places as well where you get these kinds of zones, but the densest concentration is around the Pacific Rim there. And that's where you find some of the most dangerous volcanoes on the planet.
Yeah, and I was looking at earthquake alerts and whatnot from the USGS just this morning, and there's a lot of activity all the way to Japan, all the way up to Alaska right now, and Indonesia, and it seems like the whole thing is kind of getting more and more active.
Well, definitely, it's always you always see kind of earthquakes and volcanoes together, because the same forces that go to forming these volcanoes are also generating lots and lots of earthquakes. So the Ring of Fire has always been a hotbed for earthquakes and volcanic activity, and it always will be, just because of these really strong forces that are engaged in pushing these plates together.
And then you had mentioned, and I had my eye on this too, that even Krakatoa erupted just last December, which I'm always a little bit concerned about because, the Big Mama is the one that created the Little Ice Age. And so how does that play into the global climate temperature as far as the volcanoes that we see erupting, and then what happens from that point?
Yeah, volcanoes definitely have an impact on global climate. And I think the best modern example of that might be Pinatubo. When it erupted in 1991 in the Philippines, it created some small amount of cooling globally. It lasted for a year or two before sort of going back to background. And there have been larger eruptions in the past, like Tambora in 1815 or Krakatoa in 1883, that Tambora is the famous one, resulted in something that was sort of popularly called at the time the year without a summer in Europe and North America. Global temperatures fell enough that crops actually failed. And there's a lot of other famous anecdotes about that. One of the best is Mary Shelley was sort of on a vacation at the time, and the weather was so lousy, I think they were in Switzerland for the summer, that they actually decided they were going to stay indoors and write ghost stories, and that's where she wrote Frankenstein.
Yeah, isn't that a great story? I love that.
Yeah.
It all ties together.
Yeah, volcanoes affecting literature.
Yeah, exactly. And one of our best, epic novels came out of the time because of that.
Yeah.
So potato crops became real big because you could grow them with less sunlight, and that. So during those times, and that was all volcanic activity. And I think that folks don't really realize how important it is to kind of realize what's going on with these things. We just kind of see it as a local nuisance maybe, and don't realize the worldwide effect it can have.
Yeah, the big eruptions definitely can have far-reaching effects.
So we're talking, Krakatoa now is less of a danger because its caldera hasn't grown as big as it was there. Am I correct on that one?
Yeah, so Krakatoa is sort of blown up already. It had its big eruption, and it takes a while for volcanoes to sort of rebuild their magmatic systems after these big sorts of eruptions. It's been more or less continuously active since that 1883 eruption, and it grew another cone right in the middle of the caldera that came to be known as Anak Krakatoa, which is sort of the son of Krakatoa. And the eruption that occurred in December actually wasn't a major explosion. Rather, it was that Anak Krakatoa falling apart, and that generated the tsunami that resulted in hundreds of deaths around the coastlines that were nearby. And it also exposed much of this magmatic system to seawater, and that generated a bit more explosive activity. So there was a lot of low-level ash that was generated as a result of the mixing between the magma and the hot rock and that cold seawater. So generally, these volcanoes don't have repeated in short succession large explosions, just because they need time to rebuild themselves. And so usually you only see one or two big explosions from a volcanic system before it sort of has tapped itself out. Some are a little bit different, but normally they don't have that many huge explosions in them.
Yeah, that makes sense, because it's kind of tapping itself out as it goes. It's better for it to bleed off a little bit at a time than just be one huge, massive
right. Yeah.
of activity. That makes absolute sense. Yeah. So maybe that's a good thing about the Ring of Fire is that it stays a little bit active, so we don't have as massive as eruptions as we could have.
Yeah, I mean, statistically, those sorts of big eruptions are always going to happen. The big question, I guess, we have is where are they going to happen?
Right.
The largest really big explosion, I guess the most recent really big explosion happened in, I think, about 1237 or 1238. A volcano in Indonesia had a very large explosion that had a huge impact on global climate. Those kinds of eruptions happen every, 500 to 1,000 years or so. And Tambora in 1815 was about that kind of magnitude. But the one that happened in the 1200s from Indonesia was one of the largest in the last 10,000 years or so. So the real challenge we have as volcanologists is identifying the potential places where those kinds of eruptions might happen, and then making sure that they're very well monitored so we can predict any such activity before it happens.
That makes sense. And you do that by doing the boreholes, right? And then dropping the seismic monitors down into those holes so you can see what level the earthquakes are happening?
Well, boreholes are one way of doing it. The challenge with boreholes is that they're extremely expensive and very logistically hard to do. So typically we put stuff on the surface because that's a lot easier and it's a lot less expensive. So we get more bang for the buck by putting out surface-mounted GPS stations to measure how the ground's moving and seismometers to measure the shaking. But in places where we have the funding and the support to do it, we'll also put boreholes because they tend to be a little quieter. And then frankly, it gives you a new dimension for measuring earthquakes because instead of being above where the earthquakes are happening, you're actually sort of next to where the earthquakes are happening. And that allows for a different sort of view of the earthquake process that helps us locate them better and understand what's happening beneath the ground a lot better.
Yeah, that makes sense too. Maybe is that why you get negative readings on those sometimes, like the ones that are sitting on top? Maybe they feel something that's in the air, and that's why they get a negative reading?
Well, that can happen. We do have air blasts occasionally, and those give you very weird things because they're also sensed by we call it infrasound. Basically, microphones can pick those up as well. But it depends on the datum. It depends on the reference point, and in many cases, the reference is sea level. And so when you see negative depths, that might be happening above sea level. So it may be someplace it's very high altitude, but it's still below the ground level. So it really depends on where the earthquakes are happening.
Got you. I was just curious. I'm like, how do you get a negative? Like, how does an earthquake go negative? So that definitely makes a lot more sense there.
Yeah, I think recently a lot of the monitoring agencies have switched over to saying 0 is sea level rather than being ground level, and that way it's sort of uniform over the entire planet. There's no doubt about what 0 means. Got
it. Yeah, because that gets a little confusing when you're trying to read it.
Yeah.
So in California, there's also another super volcano down below Mammoth. You know, the one that I'm referring to?
Yeah, that's Long Valley Caldera.
Yes, the Long Valley Caldera.
That's a fascinating volcano, only because it's got this, it erupted well over 700,000 years ago. I think it was about 780,000 years ago in a pretty good-sized eruption. And since then, it's had some smaller eruptions. But what's neat about that is there's this chain of volcanoes that runs north out of the caldera called the Mono Inyo craters. And that's had some eruptions just in the last few hundred years. And they tend to be not really big eruptions. They sort of put out these lava flows or small amounts of ash. But they're quite young, almost historical. So that's kind of where the next eruption is likely to happen, is along this chain of domes, lava flows, and small cinder cones that comes north out of the caldera.
Yeah, I found that fascinating. I was like, wow, how many Californians actually know that that's even in existence, you know? And
yeah.
It's a beautiful country out there, too.
Yeah, it's spectacular country.
Yeah, luckily it's not too well populated around those areas, you know, as far as California goes, because, you know, some areas are way more populated. So what do you think, like, is the risk to the families there? Like, if you're in that area, how do you prepare for this type of volcanic activity to happen?
Well, the most important thing to understand is the kind of hazard that you may be faced with when a volcano erupts. Many people might think, oh, it's just going to be ash falling or something like that, but that's not the case at all. There's a variety of different hazards that can be generated volcanoes. Ash is certainly one of them, ash falling from the sky. There can also be ash flows, where ash is rushing along the ground surface as ash and very hot gas. Lahars, volcanic mud flows, can be very far-reaching. There can be earthquakes, there can be lava flows. So it's important that you know the type of volcano you're on and know the hazard zones. Most volcanoes have some sort of hazard map associated with them that kind of tell you what sort of hazard you might expect. And so maybe if you're located near Mount Rainier, that's a volcano that doesn't have a reputation for pushing out huge amounts of ash and giant plumes, but it does have a reputation of generating very large volcanic mud flows. And so you want to know, are you located in one of these hazard zones where mud flows may occur, especially in these sort of river valleys that drain the mountain? And then if there is a mud flow, what sort of action would you take? You need to get to high ground in that case. So how would you get to high ground? How much time would you have? And so forth. So it's very important. Volcanoes are a bit like fingerprints. Each one is different. And so it's very important you understand the volcano you're at and then adapt any plans you have to the hazards that are most likely to impact you.
Yeah, even the lava flows can be very, very different, right? There's like a gooey, viscous lava, and then there's like a faster flowing lava.
Yeah, absolutely. You can probably remember the images from Hawaii back in the summer of 2018. There's very fast-moving flows, relatively fast-moving, that just sort of ate away everything in their path, very fluid and glowing red. But there's other forms of lava that are basically solid when they come out of the ground. At Mount St. Helens, there was an eruption between 2004 and 2008, and basically the lava had solidified by the time it actually got to the surface. And it came out as a series of these great big spines that just grew straight up into the air and then ultimately collapsed. So
Crazy.
the composition can even really control a lot of the style of hazard you see.
So where would they go to get the information on what their volcano is and what plan they should be making for their volcano?
Well, for all volcanoes in the United States, the U.S. Geological Survey has a website that's all about volcanic hazards, and each volcano has sort of an individualized hazard map or hazard plan. Okay. So if you go to the volcanoes.usgs.gov, you can click down through the observatories. So for example, if you're in California, you would click on the California Volcano Observatory. If you're in Hawaii, there's the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory, Alaska is the Alaskan Volcano Observatory, and so forth. And then you can click on the individual volcanoes and understand their geologic history. So that's the kind of hazards they're most likely to generate. And then look at hazard maps and see whether or not you're living in a zone that might be threatened by a specific type of hazard. And then there's civil defense agencies, maybe run by the county, maybe run by the state, depends on who the landowner is in the vicinity, that will have some contingency plans for how to evacuate an area if there is, say, a mud flow on its way and that sort of thing. So the best place to start, I think, is the USGS volcanoes.usgs.gov website. And then you can sort of pick out your individual situation and see what information there is online.
Yeah, that's some great information right there because, like you say, there's no one size fits all kind of thing.
Exactly. Right.
So that makes absolute sense. And then that's really going to drive what kind of survival kit you put together for that incident. I mean, what you're going to need or what your
right.
plan even is.
Yeah, and in general, I think of it, and I live in the Pacific Northwest of the U.S. Mount Hood is not far, Mount St. Helens is not far, but in my situation, I know that earthquakes are more of a concern. So my own kind of hazard kit contains everything I would need to survive for a couple of weeks after a large earthquake, assuming that it would wipe out power and cause problems with water and that sort of thing. And it's very similar to what I would want in if there was a volcanic eruption as well, only because I don't live in an area where we're likely to get much ash or anything like that, but services might be affected. And so that's my main concern. But it'll vary depending on where you live, the proximity to different hazards.
Right. And then I've done this topic about gas masks and that, and gas mask is not really what you want when ashfall comes down. It's more of like the particular filter mask. Yeah,
so volcanic gases tend to dissipate not exceptionally rapidly. It depends on how much is coming out, but that tends to be less of a hazard unless you're right in the vicinity of the volcano, or you have respiratory issues in general. You can think about the volcanic eruption in Hawaii. It was very bad in 2018, and in fact before then, there had been gas problems, but they mostly affected people that already had respiratory issues, unless you lived right next to the source. And there, I knew people that did have some gas masks, or they just knew that, you know, when the air quality was bad, you stayed indoors,
Right.
and didn't breathe that. But when ash is falling, yes, the more important thing is not so much gas, it's particulates. And that's why you see pictures of people, you know, with handkerchiefs or shirts tied around their nose and mouth, breathing through that to filter out the particulates.
Yeah, you don't want that stuff in your lungs. That's bad.
Exactly.
So, okay, so let's go back into Yellowstone just a little.
Sure.
And why is Yellowstone such a hot topic? Like, why is it this huge threat that we all, oh my gosh, Yellowstone eruption?
Well, I think there's two things that are sort of competing to or collaborating maybe to make Yellowstone this really hot topic. One is that it has generated some really huge eruptions. It's had 3 very large explosions. The largest one was about 2.1 million years ago. Then there was a smaller one at about 1.3 million years ago, and then this kind of medium-sized one, which of course is still huge by any other standard, about 631,000 years ago. And that's pretty unusual for one volcanic system to have 3 really big eruptions. Normally they have 1 and they're sort of tapped out. And that reflects that Yellowstone is more or less constantly getting the supply of magma from below. It's what we call a hotspot, which means it's sort of a melting anomaly in the upper part of Earth's mantle. And so there's a lot of melt being generated and fed into the system. So it does have this history of very large explosions. And then it also has been popularized, especially since the late 90s, early 2000s, with a series of documentaries, and especially there was a movie, sort of a docudrama. And I'm always surprised at how many people I see that or write me and say, you know, well, was that movie real? And, you know, is this a true story? And I think it's a bit of the true geologic story and the Hollywood version of the story sort of combining to make this something that everyone knows about. And it's also not a regional threat in the way that, say, if Mount Rainier erupts, yes, mud flows will affect areas around the volcano, but if you live in Nebraska, you don't care about that.
Right.
But, you know, if Yellowstone were to have a massive explosion, there was a fair amount of ash that fell in Nebraska. So it tends to be something that more people around the country are going to be interested in because they know it was a huge event when it did happen.
Nebraska, did they receive like a foot of ash, or was it just like, you know, 3 inches kind of thing?
It was more than a few inches, and it really depends on any future activity would depend on the way the wind's blowing and the size of the eruption. Not every eruption is alike by any means, and in fact, the most common mode of eruption at Yellowstone is a lava flow. Most people tend to think that Yellowstone only explodes, but in fact, it is quite rare for it to explode. Instead, these lava flows are much more likely, and those tend to be associated with a lot less ash. So just because Yellowstone, let's say it would in some future case look like it was going to have an eruption, that wouldn't mean it was a huge explosion on the way. It would most likely mean that there was just lava headed to the surface.
Yeah, wasn't there a huge area that was growing, and then it was it kind of diminished, and they don't really talk a whole lot about it now. I think it was like, geez, even 10 years back that there was an area that was kind of bulbous out of it.
Yeah, that sort of thing is actually pretty common, and it's driven by the hydrothermal system at Yellowstone. That's the greatest concentration of geysers and hot springs anywhere in the world, and it's because you've got 3 things that are combining in the Yellowstone region to make this happen. One is you've got a lot of heat being generated within the Earth. This very large magmatic system is heating things up. The second thing you've got is a lot of water. That's the highest area in the Rockies, and there's a tremendous amount of snowpack and a lot of rain, and so you've got a lot of water that is available to be heated. And third, the geology is just right to allow water to circulate. So you have to, even if you had this water and this heat source, you have to have a way for the water to sort of percolate down to the heat source, warm up, and then come back to the surface. And it's just an incredibly dynamic situation that's always changing. There's always new geysers forming and new hot areas forming, and other places conversely cooling down and geysers dying off. In 2003, there was a pretty significant heating event in the Norris Geyser Basin that actually resulted in them having to close a boardwalk area because suddenly the ground got quite warm right underneath a boardwalk that tourists were using.
Yeah,
but that sort of thing.
Recently as well, that one of the boardwalks actually melted.
The boardwalk didn't melt, but back in September of 2018, there was a new feature that formed basically right next to the boardwalk.
Okay.
And it was spattering little bits of mud onto the boardwalk, so they had to close that. But it was quite interesting. Like one side of the boardwalk, there was very high temperatures, just an inch or two into the ground. You go to the other side of the boardwalk, literally just a few feet away, and it was sort of background temperature. So the sorts of changes that happen on time and space are really amazing. I mean, that's one of the things I think that makes Yellowstone so interesting and so unique, is that the one constant there is change. It's always adapting to different situations based on how water's circulating and just the time of year even.
Yeah, I find it fascinating as well because, that's the one super volcano that we all know about, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Super volcano, you think Yellowstone.
Yeah.
There's many, many other super volcanoes on our planet that aren't discussed. And, why aren't they as geologically phenomenal as Yellowstone? And it's because of that setup where the water's allowed to percolate. So that's
and I think Yellowstone has this cachet too for being, one of the first, the first national park in the United States, and this really kind of wonderland of geysers and bison and wolves and elk and hot springs and amazing bacterial mats around these pools. It's sort of a wonderland in so many respects, and other super volcano systems don't have all of those elements. They may have erupted just as big or even bigger, but they're just not quite as well known, at least worldwide, as a place like Yellowstone, because there's just so much there to go see. It's so spectacular in every way.
Yeah, it's like the nature's wonderland of what happens on our planet. Yeah, very cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how about the new geyser? I know Steamboat's gone off like record amount of times in the past couple of years. That Steamboat's been just on fire. But wasn't there one that erupted that hadn't done so in like 80 years and it blew out car axles and stuff like that?
Yeah. Well, this was Ear Spring near Old Faithful, and this is what happened in September of 2018. There was some adjustment in the plumbing system of geysers, and that's not uncommon because the hot water is not only just hot, it's also bringing a lot of dissolved minerals up to the surface. And these things will precipitate out and kind of clog geyser holes. It's the same kind of thing that can happen in the plumbing of your house if you've got old pipes.
Like with calcium or something like that?
Yeah, exactly. And then some sort of, things can get cut off and new things will have to form. And so this one geyser, or this one spring called Ear Spring, had a very rare eruption in September of 2018. And it brought up a bunch of basically garbage. There was a cinder block that came out. There was a lot of change, and this isn't too surprising because people throw pennies and stuff into. Yeah, right. But there was even a baby's pacifier that came up, and I think it was like from the 1930s or something like that. It was old.
Yeah, we're not going in after that one, kid.
Right. Yeah, a lot of the things you can think of are probably things that were accidentally dropped in there. And then you think, well, that's gone.
Yeah, I'm not reaching in for it. You're
right.
Yeah, I've heard a story of one guy that was testing the water for bathing, and they couldn't even recover his body because he fell in one of the hot springs.
Yeah. Unfortunately, every couple of years, there's somebody that decides they're going to try out a hot spring, and even if they don't actually intend to step into the hot spring, they get too close to the edge. And in many of these springs, the edges they're a bit like cornices of snow. They're they're very thin crusts, and you can very easily break through, and then suddenly you're in boiling water, and you don't last very long in those conditions.
No, best to just adhere to the signs there, I would think.
Right. Yeah, there's boardwalks there for a reason.
So, what do you see, happening with Yellowstone as the Ring of Fire gets more active and things like that? It could cause activity at Yellowstone. So, what kind of forecast do you give for Yellowstone? I know it's impossible to even tell because there's so much happening there, but if you had to just give your best
Yeah.
of what was going to happen there.
Well, we actually don't see any indications of anything changing outside of normal at Yellowstone. And that kind of takes some people by surprise because there are lots of earthquakes at Yellowstone. There's on average over 2,000 a year. And in fact, just a couple of years ago, we had an earthquake swarm in Yellowstone that was over 2,400 located earthquakes. There were many more that happened that were too small to locate, but 2,400 earthquakes. It was the second largest earthquake swarm that had ever been recorded. That kind of thing is normal for Yellowstone. It wouldn't be normal at a place like, say, Mount Rainier or Mount Shasta. If you saw that many earthquakes in one of those places, something's clearly going on. But Yellowstone, there's so much heat and so much water moving around in the subsurface that earthquakes and the ground going up and down are really common. So that's the sort of thing we expect to see. That's Yellowstone being Yellowstone. If there were to be a volcanic eruption at some point in the future, we would expect it to be preceded by tens of thousands of located earthquakes in a very short period of time, and really massive amounts of uplift, many, many tens of feet of uplift in a short period of time. And the sorts of things we're seeing now, a couple inches a year here or there, the ground going down as well as going up, that's sort of the normal breathing of the caldera as all of this hot water circulates in the subsurface. So at this point anyway, we don't see any indication that Yellowstone is doing anything abnormal. And so we have no, in addition, eruptions there are so rare. Even the last lava flow was 70,000 years ago. I mean, Mount St. Helens didn't even exist as a mountain 70,000 years ago. So
that puts it in perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it's when you think about sort of all of the things that have happened in the last 70,000 years, and that was the last time Yellowstone had a situation where magma arrived at the surface. There's a lot of other kinds of hazards that are likely to occur, and that's just for a Yellowstone lava flow that would really only affect the park itself.
So we should have our eyes more on the chain that's in California than we even should on Yellowstone, in your opinion?
Well, depending on where you live, I think it's all a matter of your perspective. If you live in Mount Shasta City, then Mount Shasta, should be something that you pay attention to, much more so than Yellowstone. If you live in some of the communities around Tacoma, Washington, then Mount Rainier is something that should be the hazard, the volcanic hazard anyway, that you would pay most attention to. Of course, in this area, earthquake hazard probably is even stronger than volcanic hazard. So it's really a matter of the area you live in, and I think this is true of any hazard, because even if you say, well, I don't live any place near an active volcano or even area of active faulting, you may live in a floodplain, or you may live in an area that's prone to tornadoes. So there's very few places in the country where you're not going to be impacted by some type of natural hazard. It's just a matter of knowing what type of hazard that you're most likely to be exposed to and how to protect yourself or how to defend yourself against that hazard.
So I have one more question for you, and it's kind of off topic. It's more to deal with earthquakes. You've obviously heard about the New Madrid earthquake that happened in the 1800s, and they're starting to talk again about the New Madrid fault line lighting up. Have you seen any activity in that? And what's your feeling on that?
Well, it's certainly a hot topic of research, and it has been for some time, trying to understand, especially the recurrence interval of these earthquakes. Earthquakes and volcanoes have some differences. One of the most important is that earthquakes tend to occur with an average recurrence interval, because if the faults are moving or trying to move past one another at a constant rate, then you can get sort of an average recurrence. And it's not perfect by any means, but you can get a sense of how often the fault tends to move and what size earthquakes tend to happen. Whereas volcanoes, they're only going to erupt when there's a magma supply beneath the surface and enough pressure to get it up to the surface. And that doesn't happen on any sort of regular schedule. So there have been a lot of studies of the New Madrid fault zone and also other fault zones around the United States to try to understand how often it ruptures and what size earthquakes are common. And it's very difficult in the New Madrid region to really identify past earthquake events just because of the geology of the region. I haven't heard of any sort of uptick, any kinds of activity, but this is one of those things that we should be aware of, that there are places that are kind of non-traditional for earthquakes that can cause quite a lot of damage. New Madrid being an example, there was an earthquake in Charleston. I can't remember exactly when, I think it was in the 1800s, but Charleston, South Carolina, that was quite damaging.
Yeah.
There was that mineral earthquake. What's that?
The plates there are just so much bigger that it affects a much grander area than when it happens
right.
on the West Coast.
Yeah, I think a neat example of that was, I can't remember what year it was, a few years ago, there was the mineral earthquake in Northern Virginia, and it was felt, it was a magnitude, I think, high 4 or low 5, and it was felt throughout the entire region. And that's because the geology of the East Coast is so much different than the West Coast that earthquake waves can be felt much farther away than you would think would be possible, only because the geology allows this sort of amplification of the shaking.
Yeah.
So,
Super
yeah, there's the best key for sort of knowing that seismic hazard is a problem in your area is looking at the past record and knowing that, you know, if there have been earthquakes someplace in the past, chances are there's going to be earthquakes in the same place in the future. The question is, what's their size likely to be, and are we looking at something that happens every few tens of thousands of years, or thousands of years, or hundreds of years, or even less?
That makes perfect sense. Yeah, I just found it really interesting because everybody likes to pick on me. Oh, well, you talk about earthquakes because one of the triggers in my book is a worldwide series of earthquakes that happen, and they're like, "Oh, that's because you're on the West Coast." You know, I'm like, it happens.
Yeah.
You might not realize it, and you need to be aware of, you know, the threat that's there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of these things that people may not be aware of just because it hasn't happened in recent memory. And that's, I think, all people that work on hazards and hazards awareness and hazards communication face this challenge of oftentimes the awareness of the hazard fades with the memory of the most recent disaster. So even though we may know scientifically, such and such an area is prone to floods or tornadoes or volcanic eruptions or earthquakes or whatever, if one hasn't happened in a while, if it's faded from the memory of the people that live there, or there's a lot of new people that have moved into a place,
Yes.
it's very hard to increase the awareness of those hazards among that population.
Because there's times you have to wonder, you're like, you guys know it's an active volcano, yet you're building,
Right.
you know, all your communities right around the base. So, you know, why? What are you doing there? That makes,
Yeah.
you know, absence makes the heart grow fonder, I guess.
Yeah, or, you know, in some cases, this may be the only place that some people can make a living. You know, this is especially true in some countries like Indonesia and the Philippines, where the farmland around volcanoes is just so incredibly rich that this is the place that they have to be in order to raise crops and animals.
Oh, I got you. Yeah, I had some big questions about that. Like, why would you, you know, and then of course they're utilizing their coastlines because you're an island community by doing fishing and stuff like that. That makes you vulnerable to the tsunamis.
Yeah, and in some cases, you know, you have these relatively small islands that have a volcano at the center. You know, it's difficult to get away from the volcanic hazard, the tsunami hazard, the earthquake hazard. You know, there's a few islands that are just subject to all kinds of hazards, and there aren't many places to go if you're on an island.
Well, it's not someplace I'm going to visit anytime soon. Well, Michael, I want to thank you so much for your time today. Just a fascinating interview, and you know, I'd love to be able to go on and on, but we got some time constraints. But I really enjoyed picking your brain today. So thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you. This was fun.
Thank you, Michael, so much for taking the time out of your schedule to give us some information that we need to know on how to, you know, really find out what the volcanic risks are in our area, what those volcanoes are doing historically and what that might mean for the future, and then how to make our preparation plan
based on that information. So I really enjoyed having you on the show, and I could have gone for hours picking your brain on the geology of our planet and things like that. It's just very, very interesting to me, and so I really appreciate the time that you took to share your information with all the listeners out there. Thank you as well to all of my subscribers. As I said in the beginning, you guys are what makes the Changing Earth podcast go around, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate your support. If you would like to become a supporter, head on over to www.authorSarahFHathaway.com/support. That's www.authorSarahFHathaway.com/support, and you'll get access to all kinds of goodies. I've got the Lost Vegas years available. First couple of short stories of that book are available. I've got tons of free audio clips and video clips and stuff like that, and then also special discounts and things like that for my books as well as merchandise. So head on over there, get signed up, and check that out. Thank you very much for listening today. I hope you are enjoying the story because, it's got these really cool twists going on right now. And we'll just have to see how Erica does in this new situation she's being presented with and see how the story goes. And let me tell you, it is a wild ride. So I'm happy to have you along on that ride. And until next week, remember, dream, survive, thrive.
Thank you for joining Sarah for this episode of the Changing Earth podcast. Don't forget to pick up your copy of Day After Disaster, Without Land, The Walls of Freedom, Battle for the South, and Dark Days in Denver at www.authorSarahFHathaway.com. If you love Sarah's books and this podcast, please head over to Amazon or iTunes and let everyone know by leaving a review.